Okay. Well, we do have a big topic that we're covering today, so I'm going to get started. Thank you all for joining. Really appreciate you spending your time with us today. We are continuing our Train and Build webinar series. Today we're on webinar number 4. We're covering Bridging the Gaps, Developing a High-Performing Clinical Research Startup Team. So very easy topic. We should solve it in a slide or two. Quick introduction of myself. So my name is Nicole Brooker. I'm a senior manager here at Elevate Clinical Research Solutions. In terms of my background, I've been in clinical research for about a decade, mostly on the site side, mostly in startup. Also have worked on the CRO side. And prior to that, I had direct clinical roles and also worked in finance. For our agenda, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the webinar series, go through the ones that we've done to date, and kind of go through how you can access those if you so choose. We'll talk about the challenges in building a high-performing team. We'll work through those issues as best as we can. We'll talk about some key takeaway, and then hopefully should have some time for questions. Feel free to ask questions in the questions box of the platform throughout the presentation. As best as I can, I'll try to grab those along the way. So in terms of our webinar series, so we are on number 4 today. In terms of the first 2 that we did, those were both Call an Expert edition. We did one on CAs and one on budget. And basically what that means is, so our Train and Build service, we offer very site customized training in terms of, what topic we train on, CAs, budgets, contracts, how we train on it, in person, over 2 days, over 4 months. The extent that it's trained on, do you have brand new people? Do you have experienced people that are looking to increase their skills? We then, help in terms of the documentation, creating a playbook, creating your own site customized training materials. We do quality checks to make sure that you feel kind of good about, the training and that everyone feels like they, kind of got a lot of value and are, well-versed in whatever service we're targeting. So that's kind of part 1 of Train and Build. Part 2 is Call an Expert. So the idea with that is, we've done training on a service, but you have a question now, right? These services are hard. It's not sort of a point of like, well, I've been trained on this and now I don't need help ever again. Unfortunately, it's complicated. It's ever changing. So, if you have this question on CAs or budgets or contracts, you want to talk to someone, you want to collaborate. With the Call an Expert part of our service, it's you get a site assigned person that did your training that hopefully has thoroughly learned your site at that point, kind of understands how you guys operate, and can answer questions then after the fact. So with the first webinar, the budget edition, we took live questions about budgets. Second one, we took live questions about CAs. Then in our third webinar that we did, we really tried to get kind of to the root of why we developed the Train and Build service ultimately. It really came from talking to sites and kind of hearing where the needs are today in terms of developing a strong clinical research startup team. So this webinar was done with one of our managers, Alex. He has been with our company from the start. He was with us at our prior company, so he's been doing this from some time. Along with Jerry, who's one of our senior analysts. He has been working in research for close to 9 years, I think, working at a site. And he really did a good deep dive in terms of understanding kind of the training and knowledge pain points, from a site perspective. So I think his experience was pretty in line with a lot of other sites that we talked to, in that, when he started, he was trained by going to conferences, by doing different training boot camps and things like that. And of course, all those things are fantastic. We love going to conferences, we love constantly learning, but it's just sort of the challenge of taking this sort of general information about CA as an example and bringing it back to your site. It's not all of these steps that we're going to talk about. None of it is cookie cutter. You can't say, this is how you do a CA, and so every site should just do exactly this. There's so much to consider to actually make that a good working product for your site in particular. So we kind of talked about, the challenge of that part of things, of how do you make that site specific. And then with that, the whole, like I said, wishing you had someone that you could call and talk to about these questions, or the whole, how do you know you're doing a good job on CAs? Is someone checking the quality of your work? Is someone there to help support and guide? So that one, like I said, we really kind of try to highlight sort of the why this exists in the first place. Today we'll be talking about the startup team, and then we have one more coming up in our webinar series. Will be our final one. We're still working on topic and date for that, so stay tuned. We'll send out more information as soon as we have that nailed down. But if you have any suggestions on things that you would like to hear us talk about, certainly we're open to those options as well. So please let us know if you have something in mind that would help. I have on this page our website, which is elevatecrs.com. In terms of accessing past recordings, you can go there and then go to our hero community and go get the recordings from past webinars. You can get our white papers that we have, all free resources that we offer there. We also have our hero community discussion board there, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on in terms of what you can do with that part of our website. Okay, so we're going to dive right in with a alarming yet maybe not alarming fact. I feel like this is one of those things that on first take it's like yikes, but it's also maybe not surprising at all, unfortunately, that over 70% of clinical trials face startup delays. Of course, there's tons of different reasons for this as to why these delays occur. Some out of site's hands, some maybe things they can control or could potentially improve upon, but it's a big issue. It's something that I feel like is talked about constantly in the industry in terms of how can we make this better? How can we bring down the startup turnaround times? And to me, a lot of this starts with a strong team. Again, there are things that we can't control, that you kind of have to just be able to react to, or things like that. But in terms of kind of what's within the control of a site, where there are opportunities potentially for advancing, that's kind of where I want to focus the conversation today. So in terms of building the high performing startup team, and kind of first talking about the challenges there, which of course there are many. To have a great team, you need great people, and that's hard. What we do is a niche within a niche. Clinical research is a niche, and then doing CAs, budgets, contracts, startup services is a niche within that. I regularly joke that my spouse has no idea what I do for a living, because it's, coverage analysis means nothing to most people. So it's pretty rare to find someone that has strong experience in these services. I would say particularly with CAs, but budget contracts as well. There's a little bit more opportunity in the industry just in terms of, the sponsor CRO side needs someone to negotiate as well on their behalf. But that also then means that you're competing with them in terms of jobs. And unfortunately, a lot of times the site budget in terms of what they can offer for a position for an employee versus what the sponsor or CRO side can offer, they don't quite have the same funds. So that's a significant challenge. In terms of the unique skill set, so there's all the different skills that this person has, but then also just the experience knowledge part of things. So, clinical knowledge. Were they a nurse and they understand, what standard of care and, how to read guidelines and things like that? Have they worked within research? Maybe they're a CRA, so they kind of know research largely. Myself, I did have direct clinical roles prior to coming into this field. But clinical research was a whole other language that I had to learn. Phase 1, phase 2, CRC, PIP, PI, GCP. It's a lot to learn. So, in terms of trying to find someone to bring in, the ideal probably is bringing in someone that actually has done these services, therefore has clinical knowledge, has clinical research knowledge, has service specific knowledge. That can be hard, like I said. So, are you finding someone that maybe has done just kind of part of this equation and knows that part of things? I have in the past, done training for people from the ground up, which would be individuals that had no clinical knowledge, no research knowledge, no knowledge of the services, therefore. And, it's one of those things for the right individual, it can absolutely pan out and can end up being a great fit, and they can be a great member of the team, but it's a lot of work. There's just so much training that goes into understanding even the foundations of all this, let alone then sort of the more advanced skills. in terms of the person that, often succeeds in this role or the kind of specific skill sets that you need. So one, being very analytical, which also I'm going to apologize. I have stupid humor throughout my slides, which is not to make light of this issue. It is very serious stuff. It is very heavy topic, but I feel like we all need a little levity to carry on here and there. But yeah, I mean, honestly though, who likes reading Medicare policy? It's heavy. It oftentimes makes no sense. It can contradict itself. It's not easy to dive into. It's, in terms of the CA, you're trying to understand NCD 310.1 plus the NCD of, a scan plus the guidelines for a given indication plus the, side effects. It's just a lot to try to put together. And in my experience, it's one of those things that, it's very person dependent in terms of you love it or you hate it. I found that there's very little in between, to be honest. And then in terms of the quality part of things, so what we're talking about today, like I said, it is, serious stuff. It really does matter in terms of, are you accidentally making a research procedure standard of care? Not that these things can't be fixed when errors happen, but it can create a huge mess. In terms of the budget, did you, leave out an important item or not realize that something wasn't being calculated properly and now everything's wrong about that? For the contract, did you miss a really, not site-friendly provision that leaves them on a hook for a, subject injury and a kind of terrible, costly situation? So there's a lot in terms of, the importance of all this and the quality that is necessary to do well. And then in terms of the specific role, you can also need people skills, in terms of if you're negotiating with a sponsor CRO. One of our past beloved employees was referred to by a sponsor as a velvet hammer. You need to be able to fight for your site and what you deserve to get for a budget and making sure that you're protected in terms of your contract. But, you do want to maintain that relationship with the sponsor ultimately. Oftentimes they can have to talk to PIs, and maybe the PI disagrees with what the analyst said in a CA. That's not an easy conversation for someone to have, and make sure that it's being done in a respectful way where the PI feels heard and understands the situation. That's a tricky thing to have to deal with. And then just working collaboratively. It's in terms of the different departments and the different areas involved. It's one of those things that in terms of startups impact, in terms of the grander clinical research picture, working collaboratively is key and vital to all that. And then another kind of area to think about in terms of the skills is sort of, is this person you're bringing in an expert in CAs? Can they do CAs and budgets? Can they do budgets and contracts? Can they also do CTMS? There's certainly pros to having someone that has expertise in multiple different services in terms of, I think you build a better budget if you understand CAs, and you do a better CA if you understand the budget, and you'll do a better CTMS build if you understand on the front end how that has to eventually be entered into the CTMS. I think there's huge advantages to that. But you also do need to consider, are you, only going to bring in 2 people and your volume is intense and those 2 people can't actually handle all those services for all those studies. So there's a lot to consider for sure in terms of hiring. A couple more kind of heavy areas in terms of challenges with all this. So just the demands of clinical research, it's a field where efficiency, compliance, quality are just demanded. They're not nice to haves. It's just a necessity. It's the whole project management triple constraint. I feel like this is one of those things that a lot of you, maybe it hits home in a not great way of the do it better, but also faster, but also cheaper. It's just like a built-in thing that is always demanded in terms of clinical research, even if we know that that's not a reasonable way to look at that. What's at stake? So I kind of hit on this earlier in terms of these things do matter. They are, pretty significant things that we're talking about in terms of billing compliance. I think we've all been on those webinars where they show the sites and their multi-million-dollar fines and, how awful it was for those institutions, not only in terms of direct fines, but then paying for the cleanup, paying for consultants, for lawyers, for all of that. This stuff can have huge consequences with the billing compliance. Also, kind of maybe the more obvious one in terms of financial stability, in terms of the how are you doing your budget? A lot of sites today, particularly now, with kind of the federal funding being what it is, I know a lot of sites that are kind of in either a wait and see mode to try to figure out what the impact is, or are having budget freezes, hiring freezes. There's a lot of uncertainty right now, and a big part of that is kind of making sure that sites can cover their costs, that they can continue to fund their operations. So probably now more than ever, making sure that you are getting good budgets. And then on the back end of things, maybe not directly tied to startup, but I am a couple times in this conversation going to try to tie those two together, because I think they are very hand in hand. Are you building the strong budget to make sure your costs are covered? But then on the back end, are you able to efficiently bill for those? And do you know that you're getting paid what you're owed? It's something that comes up in site conversations all the time, where if you talk to a site and you kind of ask them about that, I would say more sites than not feel confident that they probably are owed money that they haven't gotten, which is just a really unfortunate reality. And then in terms of the process side of things, and this ties to the point earlier about, how many services is any one individual doing, in terms of kind of, how many handoffs are there in your process? Is it someone else doing the CA and the budget and the contract and the CTMS build, and they're all very siloed and they all kind of do their own thing, and there's not good communication or understanding of, like as soon as that CA is done, we got to be working on the budget right away so that we can get that into negotiations, and kind of working through that in a really detailed way, a really thoughtful way, and making sure that there's strong communication between all of those processes. And then another big part of that, I would say, is just kind of the documentation part of things. So this stuff is not easy, and time is a luxury in clinical research. I've yet to meet someone that works in clinical research and is bored in their day-to-day job. It just, time just doesn't exist. But in terms of the documentation part of things, it's so important to have playbooks, to have solid training materials, to standardize your process, because in terms of the making it efficient but high quality, the more that that's baked into your process, then you're just going to set yourself up for success. And then another complication on top of that is the whole, like I said, making it site specific. If this stuff were easy or general or cookie cutter, I could just say, here's your 10 document site to succeed. Here you go, congratulations. But it's not like there's certainly lessons learned to be had from other sites, from industry best practices, from things like that. There are certain things that I think is important as an industry to be sharing, but at the end of the day, your site is going to have some different policies, some different risk tolerance, different operational practices to consider in all of this. Okay, so I know that was a lot. It's a lot to unpack. I wish that I could say, here are these huge, heavy, complicated issues, and now here's your 5 quick steps to fix that. But I think everyone on the call hopefully understood coming to this call. It's not so easy, unfortunately. I think we have a lot to talk about, to kind of work through as best we can, to consider. But this is just really complicated stuff, and there's so much that goes into it. So I will do my very best to kind of work through a lot of these issues. Like I said, feel free to throw in questions if there be something to hit on, or if you have a suggestion from your site for something that would, help another site, we would love to hear from others. So working through the issues, in terms of kind of how you're going to build your team. So there's, 3 probably common approaches to this: hiring an individual from the outside to your team, hiring a vendor, or growing from the inside. So in terms of hiring from the outside, so pros and cons. I'm very analytical. It's very crazy that I ended up in clinical research. I like a good table. I like laying this all out. So if you're hiring from the outside, a huge benefit there, hopefully, is that you're bringing in experience, right? You have less costs in terms of having to train them. They can get up and running pretty quickly. They know what they're doing. They can help your site hopefully sooner rather than later. The training should be pretty minimal. And they can also bring in a new perspective or more knowledge. Something that I really appreciate in terms of my role and my team is that, I have some individuals that I brought in that I worked with in our prior company that were rock stars and I want to work with again. But there's also some new people that we brought in that, worked for a CRO, worked for a site, that have these unique perspectives and knowledge. And it's one of those things of, I think a lot of times I learn from my team more than they learn from me. Like, it's just, everyone has such valuable insights and experience. And to me, that's a huge part of this process, is being able to collaborate as a team. In terms of the cons of the hiring from the outside, so things to think about there. Yes, they might be experienced. Is it the right experience? Is it high quality experience? In terms of these services, there are like different certifications that exist within research, but there isn't like necessarily a set training program for all individuals. So, through no fault of their own, they could have just not really been trained properly. And so they, you don't know what you don't know, kind of thing. So with that part of things, in interviews, I think it's worth getting technical with people where you can, to really kind of try to understand that of, what is your actual knowledge base, which isn't to say at all that, if you have the right person and they're trainable, even if they didn't have great training before, that, they couldn't be a good fit for your institution. But I think it's helpful to understand sort of, what are we working with? Like, what is the level of training that is actually going to be required? Another part of that to just kind of consider is, maybe they're highly experienced, but are they still willing to learn and take feedback? Unfortunately, sometimes an ego can be involved. And this is the kind of field where, to me, I'm learning something new almost every day. And someone coming from the outside, having to learn your institution, maybe, again, they didn't get the best training before. So there's some things that you kind of have to retrain on. Is it someone that you can actually feel like you can develop them in the right way? Again, you'll have to train them on your institution in particular, how you operate. Are you centralized? Are you decentralized? Who do they need to talk to about what? Who's their escalation point? What are your processes? That kind of thing. And then going back to the points before, it's hard to find these people, and it can be kind of expensive trying to entice them to come over to your company versus a different opportunity. Another option is hiring a vendor. So, not maybe bringing someone into your team, or only bringing some people into your team, but then outsourcing some of the work. So with that, there can be broader experience in terms of, for me and my own knowledge base, I was just beyond fortunate to have someone that trained me from the ground up and spent a lot of time doing that. But in terms of my learning and obtaining knowledge from there, a lot of it came from the fact that I talked to different sites, every day, and I learned different best practices from different people. So it does help to kind of have access to someone that has worked with a lot of different sites. It's one of the questions that we get most often is, what are other sites doing about X? Because unfortunately, it can be a little isolating at times in terms of sites being able to network with other sites, learn from other sites. So I do think that's, an important consideration. Being able to ebb and flow with workload. So, if you have a full-time employee versus if you have a vendor that, maybe you have a month with 2 studies, maybe you have a month with 15 studies. As long as there's not contractual minimums, which definitely look out for that, it should be something that is a little bit easier cost-wise to have some flexibility with that. Collaboration, of course, all this stuff depends on who you're working with, but in theory, you should have someone that you can then collaborate with in terms of best practices, what they know about other sites, where there's some opportunities for improvement. And then, if you're not having to hire yourself, you don't have to deal with the hiring costs, training costs, benefits, if they leave and you have to start over again, all of that. Some cons to consider as far as vendors go. So, are you getting a cookie cutter approach, or is it actually institution specific? So, again, I'm going to mention this probably a couple more times. There's so many site nuances to consider to make sure that you're doing this in a way that will make the most sense for your site. So that's an important thing to make sure that that's actually being accounted for in a thoughtful way. Cost control, what's the pricing structure like? Do you know what you're getting, or are you going to be, unpleasantly surprised when you get a future invoice situation? This one I think is important. Are you able to speak to the person that does the work in terms of what you're getting? So, you have a question on your CA and you want to talk about something to make sure you understand why something was done a certain way. Can you talk to the person that did that to kind of have a productive conversation and make sure that you understand it and kind of the different options and justification there. And then, of course, with your outsourcing, there's kind of inherently less control in terms of it not being someone directly on your team. So I would say important overall to make sure that, you do know what you're going to get in terms of quality, turnaround times, all of that. I'll of course say that these cons don't apply to Elevate, but I'm just, mentioning them as potential things. Another option is grow from inside. So, maybe you have a coordinator right now who is awesome and you know that they're a great worker and you know that they would succeed if they wanted to do CAs. Or maybe you have someone that just does your contracts but wants to get into the budget side of things. That can be great in terms of they, already understand your institution. They already understand clinical research. You kind of know what you're getting in terms of the person. To me, experience is huge for sure. But the person or the skill set or, just kind of their willingness to learn, to help out, to collaborate, I would, if it's, I would say most situations, I would rather kind of take the right person versus the right experience or the right exact experience in terms of, making that opportunity work. And then also, you're able to offer up a different career path potentially, or, growth opportunity within your institution. Some cons to consider there. So, training on a service, even if they do know contracts, budgets in some ways ties into that, like payment terms, obviously, but there can be a lot of training involved with that. It's not easy to step into a coverage analysis. So you're going to have to do a lot of specific training around that, which again, it could pay off in the end, but it might be a lot of work. How many services do you want to train them on? Do you want them to just do the CAs? Should they also do the budget so that they know the implications of what they're doing? Things to think about that. In terms of the training and quality checks, who is going to actually train this person? Something that comes up a lot in conversations with sites is, we know someone that would do the training within our site. There are one rock star that currently does all of our CAs. So somehow we have to have them keep doing all the CAs, but then pull them over to train this person and do their quality checks and things like that. It's just, again, like the luxury of time and the luxury of extra resources is not common for sites. So that's something to consider to make sure that, maybe you have a really trainable person, but can you actually give them the training that they need? Or whether that's, sending them to conferences and the budget around that. And if you feel like that's sufficient training or not in terms of kind of what you need to have a quality person. The resources part of the thing. So, do you have training materials for them? Do you have a playbook? Do you have policies that they can use? Is this stuff, easily available so that they can succeed in their job? Again, another item that it takes a lot to effectively put those things in place. And then again, is there an expert you can turn to when questions come up? So maybe they're fully trained, you have the resources, they're up and running, but now you've encountered a situation that you've never encountered before and you don't know how to deal with it. Or you don't know, a device one is a common one that we talk to sites a lot about in terms of, this procedure is kind of like this procedure that already exists, but there's also these 10 new research components and it's this type of, there can be some pretty heavy, complicated situations where, again, for myself, I feel really fortunate that when I have a question, I have a group of experts that I can turn to and talk to and get other opinions and collaborate and work through things. It's hard to go it alone with this kind of stuff. Another consideration, kind of whether you are bringing someone in or developing talent, is just sort of the experience quality aspect of things and the cost implication of that. Of course, sites have to be very site or cost conscious, especially today. If you're bringing someone in and they have a lot of experience, they're probably going to come at a higher cost in terms of the salary that they're willing to accept versus someone who maybe has less experience, doesn't cost as much up front. I think it can be easy to lose sight of the big picture, essentially. So maybe you're saving X amount of money today, but how much more money do you have to spend on their training? Not only in terms of their time that isn't going towards your study, that's just going to your training, but whoever's training them, that's you're taking them away from studies and having to do that. Or again, if it's conferences or something else, how much money do you have to kind of stick towards that? Cost of mistakes, again, like unfortunately, some of this stuff can really impact site operations, site finances. They can create a lot of issues. So if you have someone less experienced that maybe, again, you don't know what you don't know, they're not fully trained, they don't have what they need, what is the cost of that? Cost of inefficiencies. So if it takes, one person 3 days to do a CA and it would take an experienced person 3 hours, are all your studies on pause now because it's taking so long and things are stuck at the CA point of the process, and that's affecting your overall startup timeline. And then cost of lack of knowledge kind of ties to training, but something that I think about with that is for a lot of these things, if you've worked on a cardiac device CA budget contract, and that's kind of the only thing that you've done, and then you get your first CAR T trial, whether it's the CA, the budget, or the contract, there are just very specific things to both of those. And that experience in one certainly helps with the other. There's no question about that. But, there's just so many specifics to know and understand about that. So in terms of, the experience part of the thing, it's kind of important to think about it that way too, is, is it the right experience? Is it the experience that your institution needs? Maybe you're the central office for all departments and they have to know oncology, cardiology, neurology, all the different departments doing research. So again, I think the key kind of challenge here is thinking about immediate costs versus the long-term costs. Okay, so in terms of building a strong foundation, so I mentioned this a couple times now, but I kind of want to dive into it a little bit more, and that's really coming down to having the right resources in place. And this in part goes to the whole do it better but faster but cheaper part of things. Is the only way that actually can make any sense whatsoever to me is building the quality and efficiency into the process. You can have the best analysts in the world, but if they're not set up to succeed with the right tools and the right plan and workflows and documented processes and training materials, it makes it almost impossible unless they're creating that for you. It's just, there's so many inefficiencies that can come without having these things in place and without spending time to do it in a very thoughtful way, in a very detailed way, in a way that brings in the key stakeholders, understands hurdles, where there's opportunities, where things can be more and more efficient. Again, I do want to go back to the fact that I mentioned before, appreciating very well that no site has extra time. This part of things is one of those things that it does take a lot of time to do. But in terms of the potential kind of long-term payoff, I do think it's there. I do think it is something that truly does make a difference if you're able to spend time on these items. I would say for our company, we have a lot of fantastic people. And I think / hope they would agree with me that like part of it is also in terms of us being able to do well, to do things efficiently, to do things in a high quality way. It's because we really spent some time being thoughtful about baking that into our processes and what we do. But again, the key kind of challenges with this is that doing all this takes time. It takes expertise in terms of knowing, what to look out for, what to include, what not to include, what to think through, trying to problem solve all of it. And then also your institution, again, it has to be specific for your site. What is your policies? What are your non-negotiables? What are your areas of inefficiencies today that you can work through? So I think there's a lot to unpack there, but that's definitely one area that you're going to get a lot of bang for your buck to try to tackle that part of things in terms of having a strong performing startup team. Leadership buy-in. So this might feel like a little bit of a tangent, but I'll try to kind of explain sort of how this ties into everything. So something that comes up in a lot of conversations with sites, like alarmingly a lot, I would say, is just sort of like the lack of fully integrating the coverage analysis into the site processes. So talked to a site recently that said, our leadership wants us to negotiate the budget right away. And so we start budget negotiations at the same time as the CA. it's one of those things that I hear that, kind of makes my stomach sink. So my follow-up question is always, do you have a process where later you're checking those two documents to make sure that it's saying the same thing? Oftentimes it's no, we don't. Or another thing that'll come up, are you doing CAs? Yes, we print out the schedule of events and the coordinator marks what's standard of care on the schedule of events. Those are the kind of things that, in terms of the value of the CA, I think a lot of you on the call probably hopefully understand that. And it's just one of those things that's hard to convey the importance of it, and that it's great that you want to start your budget negotiations right away so you decrease your overall startup timeline. 100%, I'm with you. But if you're not doing the CA first as part of the process to then build your budget, I would say, I don't know, 70, 80% of the time, you're probably missing items that you need to add into your budget, or that, the sponsor says something standard of care and it's Medicare has an NCD that it's very much not, and they need to be paying for that, or they inadvertently missed a time point. It's one of those things that, like, in terms of the finances of it all and protecting your site and making sure that you're billing appropriately, I can't, begin to say enough how much the CA dictating the budget matters to the overall process and for your startup team to be able to be effective for your institution and what they're trying to do. In terms of the, our coordinator looks at the schedule of events and marks things standard of care. Like, absolutely, that's great that you are getting clinical team feedback, because it is important to understand, what is standardly done at your institution in terms of, standard clinical practice. But, it's different to say we standardly do this and this is appropriate for our patients versus what Medicare is going to pay. Again, none of this stuff is easy in terms of like the conversations, in terms of getting the buy-in, but it's another area where if you have any opportunity to kind of dive in, have these conversations, lay these things out in a very concrete way in terms of it directly impacting your bottom line, or directly impacting, your ability to fully cover the cost of the trials and, make sure that you're billing in a compliant way and not having denials. Those things really matter. Beyond that, in terms of being able to accurately discuss costs of patients, if there were to be a Medicare audit, this is your tool that you should hopefully have in hand, and then you can very successfully navigate that situation. I'm going to bring up the back end of things again, or the back end of the process again, in terms of tying that to startup. I think this is something that I've been hearing a bit more in the conversation, in terms of thinking about it that way, which I think is great. I don't know that it's still being talked about quite enough in terms of, beyond the CA building the budget and that being vital. Ultimately, you're building the CA so that you're billing appropriately on the back end, so that when they're doing the claims review and they're pulling off the charges, or they're adding the NCT number or the modifier of things, so that that's being done in an accurate way. And I don't know that that's kind of always thought about in terms of the whole process of things. I know I've spoken to sites about, like their claims review is being done in kind of the not within research, so not someone that kind of understands that process, and that can be hard to manage that and to get the understanding around that. So I think these are all kind of really key areas to have the conversation around, in terms of making sure that CA is not just a checklist item, because it's one of those things that it's easy to see it that way until it's not, until there's a big problem. Kind of going off that, but a little bit different in terms of the team buy-in. So again, there's a lot of people that need to touch or understand the CA, or should be. Focusing again on the back end side of things. So I think one other thing to think about with that is the person doing the CA knows the study probably better than they would like to, right? They've spent 8+ hours looking at the protocol every which way, diving into the budget, diving into the informed consent. They are intimately familiar with that study. It's going to be an Excel file that's handed to someone, down the process, who knows maybe nothing about the study, who has to be able to hopefully find the code on the CA for the item that they are looking at in the claim, and be able to easily say, oh, this goes to insurance, this goes to sponsor, or, this is a non-qualifying trial and therefore we don't have modifiers, or it is qualified, all the different nuances of it. So the other part of kind of getting understanding about the CAs, going back to the clinical team. So it is really important to get feedback from them in terms of clinical practice and things like that. But in terms of, a challenging point there in terms of getting their understanding is the whole getting stuck on routine costs versus routine care. Um, I hear this time and time again in terms of, but the PI said they always do X. Um, Rather than having those battles every, study or every couple of studies in terms of, if a PI is kind of always fighting for things, if you can do some degree of training, again, appreciating time is a luxury, for the different parties that are going to touch the CA so that you guys are all talking the same language, so that when you're bringing something to the clinical team and they're like, well, we always do this, and you can just say, oh, this is limited by an NCD though. And that's the end of the conversation. You're just in terms of finding the efficiencies and again, being able to leverage your successful startup team in terms of the overall process. It's another kind of bang for your buck kind of item in terms of it's going to take some time to work through that, but the more understanding there is and collaboration and everyone's kind of speaking the same language and has the same understanding, then that's where, again, the CA doesn't have to just be a checklist item when a major issue arises. It hopefully is actually a vital tool that's being used throughout the process. One last thing I'm going to hit on, and this is kind of a bigger picture item, but I did want to kind of mention it again, kind of with what's going on in terms of federal funding and the impact to sites today. That obviously is hugely impactful, something that, for a lot of sites, it's frankly scary to kind of understand what that's going to mean. And sites are kind of trying to plan from here where they go, how they handle things. But, even if all that weren't the case, something that's always true of clinical research is always changing. I recently went to a conference and a Medicare contractor said that Medicare policy changes every 8 minutes, which is another one of those facts of yikes, but also, yeah, that makes sense. I believe it. There's just always so much change. And I think a lot of times for institutions, you can, despite all that, despite that there's constantly different things going on and that you need to adapt, you can still run into a mindset of we've always done it this way. Or to document our processes, that would be too much. That would, and again, it's not that I'm not saying I don't appreciate kind of the arguments for that, but it's just in terms of kind of being aware of the industry as it is and kind of the challenges that we're up against. I think that's important to kind of think about that, one, you do have to be able to adapt that in training in terms of like getting a strong team. It's not a one and done. It's an ongoing thing. Again, I learn something probably new almost every day. There's always new things. When that feels very overwhelming, which it can, I at least try to remind myself is, at least part of why the chaos, and some of it's just chaos, to be frank, but some of the constant change and trying to handle all that is that treatment is always advancing. And, I think as an example, I always use CAR T because I think that was one moment where all sites went, whoa, what is this? How do we handle this? What there was a lot to deal with, but like, look what that's done for treatment for patients today. It's amazing. It's the advancements that are out there are amazing. So I think that is important to keep in mind sometimes because it can feel like a lot is that, there are some of a lot of that comes with it is not for without cause, but it ultimately comes down to being able to be adaptable. And part of like the managing change and still being able to drive adoption of some of these important things, I think comes down to demonstrating value. And I would say particularly right now, demonstrating financial value, because at the end of the day, even if you're a nonprofit, you have to find ways to cover your operational costs, right? You have to be able to exist and pay your employees and all of that. So I do think that as part of that conversation, it can be helpful to highlight, hey, the importance of the CA comes down to the reducing the billing errors, reducing denials, protecting our revenue. For the budget, I mean, that one maybe is a little more obvious in some ways in terms of the profitability impact. The contract, there are financial interests and risks inherent to the contract that we need to look at. The CTMS, it might be making you a lot more efficient and kind of helping with overhead. Again, going to the back end and the AR part of things. If you are negotiating an awesome budget but not actually getting paid for that, you're not actually getting that money, so it doesn't actually really mean anything. So it's just to really try to highlight here how much all of this matters in the grand scheme of things, not only in terms of being efficient, doing things in a high quality way, reducing the startup timeline, which is talked about constantly in the industry now. But at the end of the day, it's bottom line dollar and the impact there. And then of course, obviously it's the big one that I think a lot of us are in research for is the patient. You're getting treatment to patients faster, and that matters immensely. Final key challenge I know with all this is that research is very busy. Everyone wears multiple hats. I feel like there's certain truisms about clinical research. One of them is like everyone wears at least 5 hats. That's just the norm. It's very stressful. It's a lot to navigate. It changes a lot. It's a lot. It's just a lot to deal with. But you're not alone in this. There are others on this call. There's others in the industry that have probably dealt with whatever exact complication that you've dealt with, and they might have an awesome suggestion for that. This is where Hero came about. So going back to our website and the community resources, our Hero community is helping elevate research operations, and is really intended to be a by sites for sites space where you can ask questions, other sites can respond, you can seek advice, you can commiserate, you can whatever is helpful. It's completely free. It's not a commercialized product by any means. It's just a space for sites to connect on different things, because I do think for a lot of this stuff, it can feel overwhelming. I didn't have a magic solution I could share. I hope talking through some of that still was very helpful. But again, I think a lot of my own knowledge comes from other sites that have found something awesome to do that if another site knew about it, that would be so helpful. So it's just to kind of bridge that gap in terms of being a little bit isolated from other sites and trying to provide a space where you can connect on whatever questions you have or whatever you need help with. We do have a pretty growing list of users in the community. It's I think we're in like month 2 or 3 now of it starting. So it's really gained a lot of momentum. We have some really good conversations going now in the community already. There's one about different CTMS systems, which is always a hot topic in terms of which one do you like? What are the pros and cons? We're shopping around. There's some good tips around that. Oncology imaging guidelines was a recent conversation in terms of which guidelines do you use. One member of the community had a really awesome point about the NCCN guidelines that I tend to agree with myself, and I thought was great that she had shared that. Another topic that we posted about recently, of course, is the federal funding impacts. Just trying to create that space so that if you do have questions, if there are things that you can share with other sites, even if it's just a tiny little tip of like, hey, our institution did this and it felt helpful. I can't stress enough that it might seem small to you, but it could help another site immensely. So please share, please ask questions. We really hope that is a valuable space in terms of kind of being able to network with other sites and learn best practices. Okay, so starting to wrap things up here. So some actionable takeaways. So first, this one might feel very general and generic, and but I think it's still worth saying in terms of considering the best options for your site and discussing it holistically. There's a couple different points throughout the way that I kind of talked about in terms of thinking about the big picture and processes and how things impact you in the short term or the long term. I think when you're feeling overwhelmed and short on time, it's it can be easier to not think that way, or you don't really have the opportunity to think that way. But in terms of kind of the big picture and being able to have a high performing startup theme, I think it does make a difference if you can. And again, if you're looking for people to collaborate with on certain things, please post in the Hero community. Building the foundation, if I had one point to stress kind of in terms of the most effective option, I think in all of this is that part of it, is the getting solid training materials, getting a solid site playbook, documenting your policies, documenting your working through your workflow in terms of what's working today, where is there an opportunity to shorten time. Time is everything, of course. Is there a more effective way that we can be doing this? It's worth that exercise of spending some time on that and trying to document that all out. And then just again thinking about the ongoing training part of things. It is a great industry for people who love to learn. If you're someone who wants 5 quick, easy steps that you do in your job every day, you might, hate your job in research. But there's always things to learn, and if you want to kind of keep staying ahead of things and making sure that your operations is succeeding, a big part of that is the knowledge part of that, and making sure you're staying on top of things. The other, if I had a number 2, I guess, in terms of kind of key things to take home in terms of bang for your buck is the communication part of things. I know, again, it might seem like a little, silly trite thing to say, but not working in silos, having good collaboration, having strong communication so things aren't sitting, so people understand what's happening with things, having a good process to work through that in terms of managing what you're doing. There's many different ways to do that, but I think the communication part of it and then having the strong foundation really makes a huge difference for sites. And then bridging the gap, which kind of ties into that in terms of the different potential handoffs and working through your own process. The more it can be a continuous workflow that doesn't have delays because of an approval or because this person gave it to that person and they don't understand this and that, the more you can map that out and kind of work through the process, the better kind of overall. So hopefully I didn't make you feel overwhelmed. That was certainly not my goal by any means, but I know this is a lot. It's a lot to wrap your head around. It's a lot to try to work through. Again, to me, find your community. I think that is huge, whether it's the hero community or you're going to a conference and meeting friends there. I always find it helpful to talk to other people and kind of hear about what they've done, what's worked for them, what hasn't worked for them, to, share experience and share advice. I think that is huge. In terms of kind of, some plugs here. So in terms of the train and build, like I said, we did kind of create this kind of based on these conversations that we've had with sites. And a lot of it comes down to, being able to use our kind of wide industry knowledge and our experts that have a lot of different experience to kind of be that collaborative voice for sites on an ongoing basis. But it's also the whole, we can do the things you would do if you had the time, right? So a lot of sites are like, oh yes, I would love to have a site playbook and training materials that are specific to my institution and all of those kind of things. That sounds fantastic, but like, when am I going to do that? Or how am I going to do that? How am I going to do that in an efficient way? We've had the benefit of doing that before for ourselves, for other sites. So, we do have sort of materials and ways that we can try to make that process easy, whether you're trying to standardize things, whether you're trying to develop materials, whether you're trying to QA work, kind of work through things, or just want someone to talk to, after the fact, or in terms of the ongoing training part of things. Like I said, it's not one and done. You don't just complete a CA training and you know everything, unfortunately. I don't know that anyone knows all the things about coverage analysis, but it's kind of where that all came about. We do as a company also just do standard services. So as I mentioned before, in terms of the different options, some sites don't want to take this in-house at all because there's a lot that goes into it, frankly. Some sites want to do it partially in-house, but partially outsource in terms of, volume and just kind of having partners to work with in this process. We do, in terms of the cons from the table earlier, I was saying that jokingly that they don't apply to us, but it is something that we have been very thoughtful about in terms of making our solutions very site centric and actually, truly being helpful for sites, and not just something that we, again, I'm very anti checklist, just checking off the box kind of thing. We want them to be helpful. So we do provide dedicated site experts. We do have transparent set pricing. We have efficient turnarounds, high quality. Our services are on demand. To brag on my team, they're very good at the do it better but faster, but more expensive, or less expensive, but do it less expensive. But that's kind of built into our process, and we have fantastic people, and I'm very, very fortunate in that way. So just want to highlight that. Beyond that, if there are any questions at this point, we do have a little bit of time here, so happy to take any questions that might have come up along the way. Let me pull up our box here. Okay. And thinking about workflow and different tasks involved, how do you best manage this? That's a really good question. That's a big question. I would say kind of step one is documenting it all, is really spending that time to do a thorough deep dive, to work through the different processes, because I think a lot of times, unfortunately, again, due to the busyness, wearing multiple hats, trying to work through it all, a lot of sites don't even know or don't even realize kind of what's so involved with their process. So I think that's a really key part of that, is doing that exercise and talking to the people that are involved in these processes, so you have that understanding of, the timelines, the what do the handoffs today look like, where do things, what is, very specifically, what is that? Is it an email to one person? Is it you know just tapping them on the shoulder and letting them know it's ready for the budget? Working through that kind of in terms of a documentation process. In terms of the process management, I guess, of it, in terms of, like, to some degree, I guess I would say that this is a really a project management kind of a thing, in terms of, uh, you know, some sites will have different kind of tracking systems for that. To, if you have a huge volume of studies, this stuff, of course, gets a lot more complicated in terms of trying to manage it all. We at Elevate partner with a company called Trial Connects, in terms of our own study management, and it kind of helps in terms of, each study, each service, what's going on with it. It has dashboards, things like that. That's, one example of different kind of software and things that are out there. So I would say that's definitely part of it. Software, if you can make that friendly for your site and kind of part of your process, of course, there's efficiencies that come along with that. I'm going to grab one more question here. We just have a couple more minutes left. Do you have any recommendations on centralizing startup? Right now, we have each department doing it separately. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of sites in your shoes. We hear that pretty commonly, that we tried to bring things in house and we were almost successful, but then we ran into someone in a certain department that was like no, and stopped it. It is certainly, it's not an easy task. There's a lot involved in it. There's a lot of key stakeholders in it. I think, again, just in terms of kind of trying to get to that middle ground, first step to me is kind of the understanding. So, this department, what are you doing today? What do your processes look like? What's important for your department specifically? Again, going to the whole cardiology versus oncology, there are certain things that you do, even if you centralize it, you still, if you're working on a cardiology study, you need to make sure that you're considering these particular factors about it. So, getting that understanding and having those conversations and bringing in the key stakeholders, I think is really important in terms of, being able to know what you're working with. From there, it kind of ties into all the other same things in terms of the documentation, the playbook, things like that. I think the one thing that you can see as a positive in terms of if you're going from decentralized to centralized is there might be a good best practice over here and a best practice over here, and they have no idea because they've never talked to each other. Or maybe over here, this is not working well for a given site, or a given department, but another department already has that problem solved. So sometimes I've been a part of those conversations too, where it's two people from the same site from different departments that have like never met before, and they do the same job within the same site. So it's kind of the same things I mentioned before in terms of documentation, understanding, communication, working through the process. And again, it's a lot. Like there isn't a quick fix to that, but there's certainly ways to do that. Question here. I'm going to grab one more. We got just 1 minute. I don't have much experience in cover analysis. What do you suggest as a first step in auto-educating yourself? So I would say a good first step is certainly there are a lot of good webinars, conferences, different trainings that exist just to kind of start to get the lay of the land kind of understanding. I won't sugarcoat it, though, that coverage analysis is really hard to jump into because there's just so much that goes into it. And it depends on, are you doing, what types of trials are you doing? There's a lot of different avenues to consider. I'm happy to talk also if you kind of want a few other more specific options, but that's kind of a good start. From there, there are more specific things like a train and build kind of program that we offer where we can kind of do a deep dive for your institution more specifically to really go from, conference, general training, understanding to that next level. But in the meantime, if you're just kind of trying to get your feet wet in the process, there are a lot of great resources out there in terms of different webinars. Like I said, we did do one on CAs. You could take a peek at that. We have a couple white papers. There are other resources out there in terms of kind of an initial step on that. All right, with that, we are at time. I really appreciate everyone's time today for joining. I was going to end on a positive quote here, just to kind of show the site impact, because I feel like a lot of this was heavy today, and I didn't want to end just on something heavy. I don't know if we have anyone on the call from University of Kansas, but I just kind of grabbed a random site fact here in terms of, in 40 years, there's little progress for AML. There's been 11 new FDA drugs approved. They participated in 9 of them. So that means their patients had access to the drugs sooner for those 9 drugs, which is monumental. So I just 10 on a positive, and in terms of everyone's impact, I don't want to lose sight of that this stuff really does matter. Working through startup and making sure that we're getting to treatment is why we're all in this, I think. So wanted to share that note there. This is our contact information. Like I said, please join the Hero community, post there. There's a lot of really smart people from other sites that hopefully will help you out. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to chat with you as well. So I will end there. Thank you very much for attending, and have a great rest of your day.